All right, question time. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out how to sort and prioritize. I guess, Craig, you had two that were related in the tech ops side, so maybe that'd be easiest to just go right for those, and then you get a break.
Then I get to take a break? Great. So I had three questions, and I'll just kind of go through them relatively quickly, and please let me know if you have any add-on. So the first question was, when do you have to start the tech ops spend for launch supply? So I think this was somewhat related to the lead times, and I guess I would just elaborate on that question, just again reinforcing the example that I illustrated. Around 2 years is a typical lead time, but for your launch, you're often launching with what's known as your process validation material. So the material that goes into kind of validating your process, which goes into your regulatory submission, is often what you're taking through the process to ultimately launch, because that's made most further in advance. So it would probably extend the timeline when you start spending those dollars more into the 3+ year time frame of when you're actually spending dollars to material that you're being launched into the market. So that's just, again, an example of when you're having to start your spend that's carrying forward to the launch. So that was the first question. The second question was, how much of the tech ops spend of $250 million is part one, committed in pre-approval, and part two, kind of a post-approval decision. And that's a kind of a hard question to answer precisely, but I would say, you're in the order of 25 to +% of that dollars that you're seeing of that 250 million that I kind of used as an example that has been already committed to well in advance of getting that approval. And that could be included in things like commitments that have been made to your CMO partner to produce supply or do any of the work that's going on. That could be commitments that are tied to the overhead related to releasing your product supply, that are other commitments that you need to make to ensure ongoing compliance of your material, stability costs, and other things associated with it. So there's a whole bunch of components that go into that $250 million, but it's safe to say that more than a quarter of it is committed well in advance of getting that drug approved. And then the last question was, can you comment on the capital expenditure required either internally, if you were a big pharma and had the dollars to do that, or via a CMO to manufacture an antibiotic, including dedicated facilities? So, again, the term capital expenditure can be expanded to include a lot of components of it, whether it's actual hard dollars to build a facility or to make improvements to an existing facility, or some of the costs that go into technical transfers, et cetera, to enable your product. So I would, as a large ballpark estimate, I would put in the order of $25 to $50 million is probably a good starting place to assume from a facility cost standpoint for making your material. And again, depending on what stage in production you're talking about, whether it's the upstream of the API or downstream in the drug product, you can extrapolate or expand that cost for multiple facilities if needed. Great. So those are my three questions for now.
So I have one that sort of gets to the heart of the intent of the whole session. So can you survive on SBIR, CARB-X, other funds, angel investors, venture capital? Yes. But survive is exactly what everybody's doing right now, right? And I may join you again and try to go another round, but all we're really doing is praying that something changes when we get to launch. I mean, there's no way for this math to make any sense. But I think these agencies are keeping the pipeline alive and keeping scientists engaged, which is huge, because we'll be starting from scratch if all of that support goes away. And again, obviously BARDA, we were a long time, 9 years, we were partners with BARDA on the plasmamycin program, tremendous leadership from that organization. I really am fearful these groups will start to say, you know what, everything's failing in the market, let's just stop investing. And we're hoping that they can hold on long enough that we can actually get meaningful change to fix the actual problem post-approval. But yeah, if they weren't in place right now, the pipeline would basically be empty and there'd be nothing sitting in it. But I think the term survive is an accurate description of what I would think it would feel like if I jump back in next week using support from these agencies, which I'd very much appreciate, but it would feel like surviving and trying to wait it out.
Yeah, we're all nonprofit, right? So that's not set out to be. But I think the challenge is in terms of surviving is the leading up to the launch. And what I pointed out, it's not over yet, right? And then actually the hard work starts again, and Occasion is a good example, and hopefully not too many follow, but after that you still have such incredible expenses. Your revenue is not there, and your support falls away, right? The CARB-X is early stage, some other ones in BARDA will get you to where you need to be, even with the best intentions of an agency and a regulatory path that may actually make certain things a little bit easier, it's still very difficult. And I'll be happy to give up the commercial infrastructure. All the other things you need to do, it will remain a survival. And unfortunately, you know, good drugs may actually go away. And so does taxpayer money and everything else that was invested in it. So I think there is still a dire need to continue to incentivize this, but really make sure that the back end gets improved with some of these reimbursement changes. So I think it's really important.
And I've got one here probably for Kevin and Rolf, one or the other, but and I'm sort of modifying it slightly, but I think it's an important topic that comes up is this idea of, you know, is it, I would argue when I look at, you know, okay, I got my drug approved via a CUTI study, and we should do HAPVAP now. I would argue that's a negative NPV. There's no benefit of doing that study, and all it's going to do is add an additional post-marketing commitment when you're finished, and your drug will probably be off patent 3 years after you finally get it done, based on all of the evidence we've seen. So, like, can you provide an example where someone did do a second study like that, spent a couple $100 million, and then boom, the sales took off because of that new indication?
Well, I kind of, I'll take it first, but I kind of pointed it out a little bit in the conversation. I'll give you an example, a very recent one, which was Avicaz, and I launched Avicaz, and it had 2 indications, UTI and II. And it had its niche within KPCs, all good. And the companies, this collective effort, AstraZeneca, later Pfizer, and Allergan, to do a pneumonia study, a hospital-acquired and ventilator-associated pneumonia study. I had to come up with the rationale why that was a good idea commercially. It's a $70 million study. Now, luckily it was a co-share, so maybe $35 million. I cannot justify $35 million in increase right now at the time of the approval of pneumonia indication. So you wonder, was it worth the investment? 30% of the time it was already used because people are comfortable with ceftazidime and other, you know, like cephalosporin, so they used it. So it's really difficult to say, well, you have to do this study. On the flip side, I think there are some examples where indications really mattered. And I think especially in like bacteremias, endocarditis, osteomyelitis are probably indications. The challenge there is just the regulatory path. Yeah. So now you have a difficult regulatory path, so now you rely on other things that help you maybe communicate that information through good publications and other strategies. But I've seen changes in, you know, the data that comes out for dalbavancin and osteomyelitis that makes an impact. So sometimes it's not just the indication, it's actually satisfying the scientific question that's there. And if it's possible through a regulatory path and get it in the label, that really allows your sales organization to talk about it and maybe differentiate. But it shouldn't preclude you from doing certain studies to get good data so that it's not only good for clinicians, but it actually could help your company as well. So I would be saying yes, new indications, but if it's not a label indication, it doesn't mean therefore you shouldn't do it. But it's a difficult decision to make because the investments are large.
Yeah. There's a question about AST timelines that I'll let Kevin field, but just 2 years ago at the same conference, there's an awesome boot camp that Kevin participated with several others that talks about why AST takes so long if you want the deeper dive. So you can give the abstract version.
Yep.
Now.
Sure. No, absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. So the question was specifically about the comment that Rolf made about ceftaroline and why it took 6 years on the automated panels. I think things have improved significantly since ceftaroline launched. We've had a lot of workshop discussions and things have improved greatly, but they still take many years from the time the drug's approved to the time you're going to find your drug on an automated panel. And that's some of the things I talked about during my presentation that's largely driven by the need to have a final package insert for those companies to finish their development. They have to know exactly what pathogens, they have to know the breakpoint, and they have to know the indications that are required for them to put together their development package, their clinical data package. There's a certain number of isolates that need to be submitted to the FDA, a certain number of isolates and their whole data package. If that is made of E. coli, Klebsiella, Proteus, and Citrobacter, because that's what you told them you were going to get in your UTI label, and you get E. coli and Klebsiella, well, half their isolates cannot be submitted to the agency. They have to start all over again. They have to bolster those data. So lots of complicated factors. I think realistically getting things down to, you know, maybe 2 years, 3 years is reasonable post-launch.
Great. On AST, one other thing maybe, and go more on the post-marketing. As I pointed out, it's like very often the studies we're doing are a non-inferiority study. So you're as good as what you have. Your microbiology is actually a key differentiating component in all of that. This is how you can differentiate your drug against organisms, either the activity period or susceptibilities, et cetera, and especially against a challenging organism. So I think, investments in these surveillance programs and ongoing surveillance and have a robust publication plan around it can actually make the difference and help differentiate your drug, because clinically differentiating becomes difficult, sometimes with an indication like we talked about, but sometimes there's nothing else to do but the microbiology. So I strongly encourage continued education around the surveillance programs.
So there's a couple sort of on, like, if you could be a magician and create a pull incentive, what would you do? I won't stop the panelists from commenting. I'm trying to avoid today trying to solve and just provide the evidence base for why we've been talking about this and why we're struggling. And really critical is everyone pushing us on, like, no, there is a better way, there's a cheaper way, you could cut this, you could cut that. I think we really tried to cut to the core. Like Kevin said, we didn't even include, like, employees. And SOX compliance accounting, which costs about $1 million a month if you're a public company. And so we really tried to get to the heart of the issue of, like, these are the things that we don't see that you can't not do. And the only reason this has worked for all this time is big companies had revenue that they were willing to throw at this huge chasm and get the product to the other side. Small companies don't have the market capitalization to do this anymore. If everybody was a $4 billion company, we'd raise $1 billion and we'd be done with it. But you can't do it when you're a $100 million company. And some of the market caps now are less than a Series A valuation I could accept starting a new company. And so I think we're just in this trapped cycle where nobody can capitalize, and the companies that have the products don't have revenue from other sources. And so just trying to avoid that. But then exactly what I warned Ralph, the question would come up as a scientist is, why do we need these marketing people? Isn't this all the expense? And so that's why we tried really hard to make sure we included things that involve quality and pediatrics and things that everyone agrees we need to have in place. But Ralph, why don't you comment, if we can wave the magic wand and just erase you from the earth, what would be the impact on the overall burn? Because we saw basically the 3 big chunks from Kevin, Craig, and you. So a chance to defend your career choices.
There's a reason I went independent. No, if I understand your question correctly, it's like the impact on the commercial organization on...
Well, really, so this question is really just what would happen if you just, like, the drug's approved, just let it be out there.
Yeah.
And so we could talk a little bit about, that's not possible.
No,
you can't just let it be out there without someone being accountable for a problem if a safety issue happens.
I think as... And that's not really, I'm not here to defend, like, you have to have this, 150 sales for, otherwise you're not going to be successful. That's not the story. I think a lot of companies are actually evaluating how they need to commercialize their products, right? And do you need a sales force if you have a very narrow spectrum drug? Let's say you have something for one bug, because now we're having regulatory paths that are very, very selective in what they could do, and you probably don't need that. If you have a more broad spectrum agent that has ultimately a large patient population that could be served in a highly competitive market, you all work for a commercial entity, and you need to have a runway and not just surviving. So I think there is a need for it. I don't think you can just get away with it. I think that's part of what I was trying to communicate, that once you get commercial involved, all of a sudden people get a little uneasy, right? Because what do they want to do? And I think my message was very much just like, and we need to, as commercial partners, we need to show that we know exactly what we're doing, we know the science, we understand how it works, and be a partner in all of this. And that's also to the external stakeholders, like the clinicians, that it's no more 6,000 salespeople that we used to have going out to the doctors and entertain and all these other things. And that was kind of commercial. And use my drug as much as you can because I get better from it. I think there is, in the space we work in, a really new approach, I think, to make sure that we do the right thing, we embrace stewardship, and be part of it, and maybe start incentivizing people differently than just on volume. That's the decoupling maybe internally rather than in the wholesale change before. So is there a need for a commercial? Absolutely, there's a need for commercial entities, because it also serves a great educational component and bring awareness to the new drugs. The study that by Warren Rose that was published, that it takes more than a year to actually do it, or by Neil Clancy, that we're still still a lot of CRE infections are treated with colistin polymyxin. It's remarkable how long it takes to change, but also actually when you're out and talk to physicians, and this can include infectious disease physicians, and explain what the difference between Abicaz and Suboxone is, or that there actually are new agents for CRE. So I think the sales force, the commercial organization, has a role in that. That should translate into revenue and sales for the right patients and appropriate patients, and not like what I said earlier. If it's not for everybody, it doesn't mean it's for nobody. So be very selective. And relative to what your product has to offer, I think you shape your commercial organization.
You want to take that piece?
Yeah, sure. So there's a question here. What is the absolute minimum medical affairs, medical marketing, pharmacovigilance needed to pretend that there's no need to create value? So I think pharmacovigilance, what I described as a very minimal program. So $1 million a year is the absolute minimum I would say you're going to spend on that. There's no flexibility there. That's a required and regulated industry. I think we heard a bit about the marketing side. On the medical affairs side, I think there's a couple ways to think about it, and it's maybe challenging to think about what's actually needed and what's not, especially coming from the perspective of the pharma company. I think the studies that I highlighted that allow hospitals to get their lab up and running with AST testing, I would argue those are absolutely required. Hospitals don't have the budget for every new drug to go through the validation process. They expect, or they need help in getting that done. The one I'm a little stuck on is the IIR, the investigator-sponsored research trials. I'm not sure what that could look like. I mean, my sense is that, especially for drugs that are approved for one indication with a very limited label, the drug's never going to be used because no one's going to know how to use it unless those studies are run. And I get the sense, and I could be wrong, I'd love to hear from colleagues that work in hospitals in the audience. The sense is that hospitals don't have the time or budgets to run those studies themselves either if they're not granted support, but I could be wrong on that. So it's somewhere in that range, you know, helping out the micro labs, getting them up and running, maybe doing a little bit of grant work to support usage in the US or in Europe. That's probably the minimum I would think you would need on those topics.
Yeah, it was interesting. I got to follow around the medical affairs people in the field for like 6 months, and I just stayed quiet and listened. But afterwards, I talked to them and say, all the physicians want money from us, but they don't realize we don't have any money. We need them to buy drug, or we're out of business. But you know, the first question is like, will you fund my trial? I want to run something new with your drug, and it's really expensive, and it's hard to get people to talk about or think about using your drug if you don't do it. Was my third-party observation. So Ralph, you touched on this, and Kevin, maybe you have an opinion, but what is your experience with guideline changes? Do they matter, and why are they so slow?
I have a similar question here. They're very impactful, first of all. I mean, a lot of hospitals will incorporate, you know, society guidelines as their treatment pathway or recommendations for what they do, and to go into the system, sometimes really copy and paste into electronic health records and things like that. So I think they're really, really important. They create validation for the drug, the fact that the drug could be used or should be used for these infections, and it raises a tremendous amount of awareness, more so than probably anything else, because most hospitals, and sometimes even by demand, to be compliant with other guidelines and J-codes and everything else, will follow guidelines and make recommendations on what treatment options should be. So I think they're very impactful. The most recent example that I showed on the slide for C. difficile is probably a good example. Is it the end-all be-all once you get on it? It depends how it's being represented, right? Just to mention may not be enough, but a prominent or first line or however they define it, or for certain organisms, I think it's very impactful. Could they be updated more often? That's probably another part of the conversation. Would be very helpful. It takes a long time for things to change. We've seen it with pneumonia guidelines. We've seen it with MRSA guidelines. Once they come out, they're very impactful, and then all of a sudden we have 3 new drugs that are not on the guidelines, and so now what selections are being made? So if there was a way to update guidelines more often, or in a different format or fashion, that it doesn't always have to be, you know, an existing guidelines, almost like an amendment, I think could be really helpful as the world changes, and so do the guidelines.
Maybe just one additional comment on that. I mean, I think the guidelines do change semi-frequently, or however often they change. There's definitely examples where antibiotics have launched 6 months after a new guideline came out. I can think of a few examples in particular. That's a really unfortunate situation for that company, because everybody's trying to implement the new guidelines and they're not paying attention to the new drug that was launched. They just can't, right? That doesn't fit. And so now you're waiting 5 to 10 years for the guideline to be updated again. So it's something definitely to consider. I think it's not something that the company focuses heavily on during the development phase, but once it's on the market, it's something we think about.
So and you had to abbreviate your section a little bit, so you didn't get to touch on it, but let's talk about the roll-up. So let's take 5 of these assets that are struggling and cram them together. So which things stay the same, which ones get better, and which ones get worse? between all of
Yeah, maybe I can start. I had a slide on it. We didn't, as Ryan said, we didn't get to it. I think the roll-up strategy is an interesting idea. I think it's an untested hypothesis. No one's actually tried this yet. The idea is that can we take a bunch of these companies with individual products and roll them up together into one company or two companies and leverage the synergies you get from reducing costs. So this is this idea that's been out there. There certainly are portfolios of multiple antibiotics, and in some cases those have done well. In my opinion, in order to make that successful, you have to have an anchor set of assets that are cash flow positive. You can't just put together a bunch of assets. I mean, you see this number here, that just multiplies when you put assets together that aren't making any money. Probably the biggest issue is that all of the post-marketing expenses essentially double every time you bring a new asset in, but the revenue, although it may double, it's a much smaller percentage. So you go from $20 to $40 million in sales, but you went from $400 to $800 million in expenses. That just doesn't work. The primary synergy you can get is through sales expenses, but that's again such a small percentage because it's tied to the revenue, not to the overall expenses. So it's it hasn't played out yet, but we'll see what that looks like. I think the other thing is you have to have a benefactor who's willing to put up the money to bring all these companies together. And I think there's people who've talked about that, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So we'll see. We'll see what that looks like.
And just adding to Kevin's point, from a tech ops perspective, while there, again, efficiencies might be gained on some of the overhead functions, like maybe supply chain and quality, from a production standpoint, again, you'd be laden with whatever manufacturing facilities you're using as they stand today. So you're not really going to get a lot of economies of scale. Ultimately, maybe you could consolidate to single facilities, but there's a lot of cost in doing that. And so in the initial days, again, you wouldn't really get much savings from a tech ops standpoint, and you'd just be taking the burden of managing more facilities and more products, which could be quite cumbersome and costly.
There's a good comment here just about sort of the cost of development. I think just in our sort of history and experience the last decade and a half, I mean, the path to approval is now finally pretty clearly defined for these types of agents. And the costs have come down whether because of efficiencies in the trials or just honestly funding support. And that's why we really tried to focus this today on pretend it costs nothing. We're still stuck. And because that's really the huge issue. Is after you get there, you don't have revenue to pay for the huge deficit that has been covered for all these years. So I think it's a really good point, just that the person's making that, it is much more efficient to get approved. That's why we're going to see a whole bunch more assets hit this point where you're going to hit this chasm, and then what happens? Who's going to actually pony up the money to get them to the other side? Let's see. So Rolf, there's one on talking again about the competitors not impacting the trajectory as much as shortages or guidelines. I guess I'm trying to figure out. So I guess basically any other sort of thoughts on that as you've seen things evolve? Basically, what are the biggest impacts to the trajectories that you've seen?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, I mean, you saw a little bit of a decline in the colistin or the polymyxin use with the introduction of Avicaz, but then you don't see major impacts with the subsequent CRE agents that were coming out. You saw the same thing on the MRSA or the gram-positives. I think what I mentioned, I think the supply, and it goes back to what Greg was pointing out, is probably the most risky part in your drug development in your first few years. And unfortunately, very many things can impact your supply, and multi-sourcing could mitigate some of that, but again, that comes with an expense, as you pointed out. But I've had supply issues because there was a hurricane in Puerto Rico and they couldn't do the fill finish. And how do you account for that? It's difficult. Or a strike in the port of Houston and drug doesn't come on land. And so those things happen and they're detrimental. And then there's the major issues of contaminations and other things that really make an impact. But other than that, competitive, I think all marketers and commercial organizations and companies obviously need to be very aware of the competitive landscape for their own drug and stay ahead of it. You can't respond to something when something comes out, and I think that goes back to once you get a drug to market, you should have already been planning 2 years before that of what's going to go next, because very often you create these data gaps and you can anticipate the market to a certain extent. That you come to market, you have an indication, now you go sell it, and it's like, oh, we need this, we need that, and so planning early, including the competitive landscape, is probably the best thing to do. But having seen now over the years the impact of new entrants, I think all boats rise with rising tides is probably the better idea, because we're creating more awareness and everybody gets a little piece of it. But it's very difficult to displace what's already there. And that, I think, you know, you see vancomycin still has 85% in the market 50 years later. So, you know, and there's some really good MRSA agents out there. And so what's going to happen with all the new agents? I think they're all good. Try to fight for a little piece, but it's very difficult to get it. And so first to market and own what you can own is probably the most important part.
So there's a question saying, basically, have we, the experts, been exaggerating the medical need for new antibiotics? And this topic's come up in other forums in recent weeks, and I don't know. I mean, you guys tell me, should we work on this or not? Is it enough people to bother to save them? I think so, but I don't know what the right number is. I know 10,000 or 50,000 is not going to sustain an industry unless we change the rules. Are we supposed to wait till there's 1 million and then the economics are easy? I don't know. Maybe we're over-exaggerating it. We shouldn't work on this for a while. But I mean, when we got into this, there were 2 patients in the United States with CRE, 2, right? And now it's everywhere in the country. It's only a few in each hospital, but this is where we're sort of at a loss. Do we keep doing this knowing that the end is going to be the same outcome, or do we change the rules? And I'm okay being open to the idea that we've over-exaggerated and there's actually no problem. I'm open-minded about that, but I don't believe it right now. And I mean, you know, you read these case studies and things are pretty desperate for some of these patients. And whatever you want to believe, we tried our best to run really good trials as best we could. I'm a pretty strong believer that colistin polymyxin aren't very good drugs, and they're being used to treat most of the patients. So, you know, I kind of look to everyone here all week for some inspiration to keep in the fight. Honest answer.
And maybe just to build on that a little bit, I think it's difficult to know whether we're over-exaggerating until it's too late, right? I mean, MRSA looked a lot like CRE at one point, and it took off. If you look at ESBL's CRE, MRSA, fluoroquinolone resistance, there's one other one I looked at. That wasn't MBL. Anyway, if you look at the trajectory over time of how they grew, they all look exactly the same. It's just the tail before things take off. In almost every case, there's a 5-year period where in that 5-year period, the incidence doubles and then it's gone and you've lost control. So, you know, with CRE, for example, where are we in that inflection point? I have no reason to believe at all that CRE won't become like MRSA. I hope it doesn't, and I hope that hospital practices and you know will help suppress it. But there's no fitness cost for most CRE, so there's no reason to believe it won't spread. If we wait to develop a drug until it is a huge problem, it's way too late. It takes 10 years to bring a drug to market, at least. That's not even really counting the research phase to discover those products. So, from my perspective, even if we are exaggerating, we still need to keep in this fight and keep bringing drugs to market, because otherwise we'll be stuck in a very dire period at some point down the road.
Well, another interesting sort of point of reference was at the same time period there were 2 cases of CRE in the United States. ESBLs were not really that different than they are for CRE, right? Mostly in CLEB, pretty low percentages, 5% CLEB, less than 1% E. coli. They look exactly like CRE looks today. And the big inflection points happen suddenly because which plasmid is going to move to E. coli? That's the question I wait to find out. And then will any of the drugs we made address that particular gene? Because we don't know which one's going to move. You know, the CTXM outbreak in like 2010, that was unpredictable. And so I think we're trying to be ready, and I think the agencies are doing a great job funding the pipeline to keep it sort of alive in the event of a crisis, but there's just this systemic problem that has always been there. We just got to fix it. So there's a question that I knew was going to come up, and Ralph, you'll be the one to take this one. I would just like to say that I did get asked this recently, what about the new CMS rules? And I just want to preface with my opinion on it, just as an advocate for the space, is it's really important that a government agency just did everything when it's within its power to try to help. Whether that will fix the problem, I'll leave it to Ralph, but that's the most important thing I read out of the CMS rule changes was somebody did everything within their capabilities to try to help the problem.
Yeah, it's commendable, that's for sure. And so does it solve? It helps. 2 things, if you're not familiar with it. So the 2 major rulings in that legislation from CMS recently, a couple of weeks ago, that will take effect October 1st of this year, so fairly in a month from now, was to increase the payment on NTAP designated products from 50% to 75% reimbursement. Unfortunately, there's only a few antibiotics right now, 3 if you will, that have NTAP. So does it solve the problem? No, it helps maybe for those drugs and in general to raise some awareness. I think the major rule that's kind of overlooked right now is not the NTAP increase from 50 to 75%, but it's the fact that CMS has actually issued new coding for resistant infections and resistant organisms. I think that will help all agents, all QIDP agents. So in other words, if you're QIDP, by definition, and for the CMS, it was deemed to be an important product because it solves a major health risk. And so you can now code for ESBL or CRE or even UTIs or pneumonias due to resistant organisms. And I think that's really changing. I have not seen, but I heard it's coming out very soon, what the actual increase is and what the differences are. So that still remains to be seen. So I think that is actually a very commendable and very, very good change that is not unlike kind of almost like a carve-out for those kinds of products, how they are being reimbursed. I think on the NTAP side, while it's good, and certainly if you have a product as a company that has NTAP, and some NTAP applications have been denied for other products, and one of the requirements in NTAP, so new technology add-on payment, right, is a substantial clinical improvement. And what I mentioned earlier, how do you do that if you have a non-inferiority trial, or you make use of a regulatory pathway from the FDA that's available with the 505(b)(2), and you basically get an approval on phase 2, which doesn't even have, inferential statistics to show that you're better than anything. So you can't, it's really difficult to show substantial clinical improvement under the guidance. They've taken away that criteria, which is that's a big improvement in itself. And so there needs to be a newness criteria, and it needs to be substantial cost. So I think everybody can justify the substantial cost. So now the newness criteria is the one that you have to satisfy, and you can apply for NTAP, and I hope every company will do that. And then the 75% probably will help out a great deal. Right now, I hope it doesn't incentivize using drugs that have it versus those that don't have it, only for the sake of the reimbursement, but do it based on good clinical judgment. But I think the big impact that CMS, besides the criteria that's being taken away, is the fact that now there's reimbursement for resistant pathogens or organisms or infections that typically were not done. So I think it has an impact, and it's certainly commendable that the agency did it.
And just there's one other related question, just talking about the exclusion of biologic therapies from this benefit from QIDP, which I wasn't actually aware. So I mean, my only answer is I like things that work. I don't care if it's a new mechanism drug. I don't care if it's an old mechanism drug with really elegant chemistry. I don't care if it's a phage. That's great. It should count, but I'm not in charge of the rules. But I would totally support it if whoever asks wants to talk about it. If someone shows something works in a trial, it should be should be included with everything else, no matter how it works. There's a question about explaining the formulary review. I think there's some really good stories from this type of thing, and like literally, like a C. diff outbreak happening and the committee not talking about your drug that time, and that costs you 6 months, But even in terms of, Rolf, like different examples of what you can and can't do when you're on formulary in different systems, like this loop of the microlab won't test your drug because you're not on formulary, but you can't be considered for formulary unless the microlab generates data for your drug. And so you end up going back and forth between the different groups, and just sort of war stories from dealing with this challenge and how different it is in every institution.
Yeah, one thing, the formulary is not the end-all be-all. Like I said, sometimes it's not on formulary, it's available, you have access to the hospital, you can talk about your drug. So there's opportunities there, but very often the formulary then becomes, in other institutions, kind of like the rate-limiting step to make things happen. And it's difficult sometimes to connect the dots because you, let's say a sales representative in the hospital trying to get your drug on formulary, but you're talking to individuals. You talk to the ID physician, you talk to the clinical pharmacist, you talk to micro, and they all need to talk to each other. But they don't always like each other. And then all of a sudden, that's your rate-limiting step, and you can't do it, right? And there's a stewardship program as well. They have to meet on this one, but they want to look at something else first. So it's difficult to, and this is not a crybaby, because, oh, this is so hard, or my job is so hard. It's just the reality, and I understand some of it. But getting on formulary very often, restricts the access. And to your point, if it's not on formulary, or but it's still available, I'm not going to test it because I have to justify my time, and there's other things I need to do. And I have 10 patients on Zosyn, and I need to get the susceptibilities. I'm not sure what's going to happen when they go on Avicaz or Vabomere, and I'll deal with it then. So formulary is important. It's not the end all be all, but it's a very complex process, different in every hospital. And I think part of it is some hospitals don't have very strict formulary processes. They just put every drug on and let physicians decide. Others are very restrictive. and have a very tight lid on it. So unfortunately, the answer is a little bit depends. Are there horror stories? I think plenty. It's very difficult landscape to navigate.
Maybe just two things to add to that. So there's a sort of sub-question here. Can't a doctor just prescribe a drug? And that's a very complicated process for those of you that have been involved with this. So there's two sort of factors that I wanted to mention. One is AST availability. So just because a drug is approved on an AST device doesn't mean it's actually on that AST device. So, you know, often, especially for the automated systems, they have a limited number of drugs they can test in their standard panels. So new drugs get put on a secondary panel only when a patient has an MDR pathogen. And when that hospital wants to test that drug. So just because it's approved on the AST device and just because it's on formulary doesn't mean the drug's ever getting tested. It's an institution-specific decision. The second thing is that, you know, one of the things that can come out of a formulary review is restricted with an ID consult, and that often means that in the electronic medical record system, most physicians in the hospital don't have access to some of the new drugs. They don't even see them. They don't show up in the electronic medical record. So, you know, there's a lot of, it depends on the hospital, but there's a lot of complicating factors. I sometimes tell the story. I have a relative who's a hematology oncology nurse at a major medical center in the area where I live, and one of the world's flagship hospitals for for bone marrow transplants. And she recently told me that she was really excited because they got 2 new drugs that were available to them, and it was about 5 years ago. And I said, "Oh, what did you get?" And they said, "We got these 2 drugs. I've never heard of them: daptomycin and meropenem." I was like, "What?" You know, so these are just the things you hear. So it's just a lot more complicated about what is available to prescribers. So.
I guess I'm trying to make sure I understand. So again, going back to the core cost. So what parts of the cost could be removed if there was no need to do formulary expansion? I don't know if they mean label expansion or, but essentially, I mean, where are the other areas we could cut if you were willing to? I mean, you can't take quality risks and things like that, but I think we've got to a little bit of that with, for example, you don't have to do investigator trials. That's probably, but a lot of these costs, the reason we went to these costs were these were the ones you sort of have to do. That was to sort of build the core thesis. But can you think of something else that if you were just sort of like barely trying to keep the drug on market, and Craig, maybe you could comment too on this idea of, can you just leave it out there and let people use it? Maybe you can comment on some of the things that legally are not.
Yeah, I think you've already answered the question. But yeah, so I mean, on the technical side, I mean, as Ryan mentioned, oversight and accountability is a key component, and I talked a little bit about the compliance considerations. So, you know, on a yearly basis, there's a number of considerations that we need to take into account, whether it's the stability of the drug and making sure that, again, the drug continues to be safe, pure, and effective. On an annual basis, we're required to submit an annual report to talk about the quality of the drug and, again, costs that are associated with that. And just from a general oversight, it's critical that the owner or the license holder is maintaining that quality. So all the oversight that goes into that, whether that be your facilities and auditing them, again, you just can't let that go without any oversight, because you run the risk of having the issues that you've seen with some suppliers where they end up with a stock out because of quality concerns or because of health authority inspection. So you really need to stay on top of that. And so you could maybe think about ways that you would limit that oversight, but there is some critical components of that oversight that are required to ensure that you're able to, again, get drugs into patients' hand and feel really that those drugs, again, continue to be of the appropriate quality.
So just I guess the last sort of, to sum it up, it's a question sort of an example in the last 5 years of a company successfully launching a new antibiotic. I'm pretty sure unless people had the revenue to put it in and lose it and get to the other side, nothing's made it. But, you know, when Rolf showed the Zerbaxa and Abicaz numbers, which I think are both really useful, successful, important drugs, neither of which I worked on, but I think they're great, it's a little hard to get your head in the game that you're going to go back and do this again, because those are 5 years in and it's just not really that much money. And I wonder if they've even gotten back to zero yet on either product. And one of them was first to market. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it's basically one of two scenarios. It's somebody's willing to put their money from their product that actually makes profit into this and fill that gap. Or I can't think of an example of someone making it through. And we did try to break down the daptomycin case study. We had a little bit of difficulty pulling data from the really important point, which was right when they were launching. I think one of the big differences is the market capitalizations for companies like Cubist weren't nearly as toxic as they are for the current companies. So you could go raise the money to finish the job if you were committed. And that's really where we're all stuck right now. We've collapsed the marketplace. No one can raise the money in equity to finish this work. and all of the products that are being pushed forward with push funding are going to hit the same brick wall. But happy, if someone has an example of the last 5 years during the course of the week, I'd be really excited to talk about how we could mimic that for sure. And we're pretty much at time. Ursula? We'll just sit here so we don't disrupt you.
We're coming to the end of the first day of this conference with the 2 boot camps that were sponsored and coordinated by GARDP with its Revive educational program, CARB-X, the Repair Impact Fund, Wellcome Trust, and JPIAMR. We were spending the entire life of an R&D cycle, including marketing and selling the drug. And it doesn't come with any surprise that it's a challenge wherever you are in the R&D cycle. If you have a suggestion for another topic for next year's conference, then please let us know. We want to be as close to your requirements and your needs as possible. And I'm wishing you a successful evening and lots of interesting discussions. Thank you for your attending.